Hello and welcome to session 21, where we'll continue with our discussion. In the world of politics, when name calling takes place against those on the other side, it's sometimes done simply as a result of anger and the heat of the moment. At other times it's done more purposefully in order to somehow try to cause a stigma of some kind arising from the name called to be attached to the other person. They hope to attach a label, or an undesirable label obviously, and one that will hopefully stick to the person of the opponent or opponents. Attaching a negative label to their opponents is something that politicians from both sides have been able to accomplish successfully as a way of ridiculing those who care about certain important policies in order to make those who care less effective in their efforts to bring about change that will benefit the people in ways that truly make a difference, a positive difference in their lives. Another aspect of name calling comes into play all too often when our country is considering ways to resolve differences with other countries. Some want to go to war at the drop of a hat, or at least it seems that way, while the whole time they're proclaiming loudly that, of course, war should be undertaken only as a last resort. Remember, however, that the more military conflicts, the more profits for the so-called military-industrial complex, in whose pie so many of the politicians in one way or another have their fingers. Of course, those trying to move the country toward war will never say they're for war. They're for peace. Of course they're for peace. They keep telling us that they're for peace. But somehow they seem, far too often, to have no reasonable alternative but to end up going to war. On the other hand, there are those who believe that diplomacy is the best course to follow until and unless there's no further recourse. At least reasonably so. They feel that it's best to try to resolve things by talking them through, when it's reasonable to do that. They're usually labeled as unpatriotic by those who seem to believe that belligerence and/or war are the only answers to every disagreement. Or could it be that some of those who push for war, or those who lobby them to do so, or back them financially, might have monetary gain to be made by the waging of war? Look at the billions of dollars made by Halliburton and its subsidiaries during the Iraq War. I'm reminded again of what President Eisenhower said about the military-industrial complex as he left office. So should you be also. Get informed. It will be well worth your time. Although reasonable politicians sometimes seem not to be in the majority, most reasonable politicians and average citizens believe that it's the proper function of government to provide social programs to assist those who are unable to help themselves or who may need a boost up temporarily to get them on their feet. These people rightly believe that when needed, we must at times become our brother's keeper. These same persons will almost always agree that diplomatic negotiations involving a coalition of countries, and including sanctions if necessary, are a better way of resolving differences in the vast majority of cases than going to war. Some who disagree will often call those who seek such reasonable solutions bleeding hearts. Maybe they should consider the thought that Jesus didn't necessarily approve of the killing of one's fellow man. He didn't approve the killing of one's fellow man, no matter what the reason for it may be. Think about that. I will continue in our sessions by stating that since we have been discussing the more negative and hurtful policies of some, too many in fact, politicians, including some of our presidents, it's a good time to state that in my opinion, historians will record the previous administration and those in control of both houses of Congress during most of that administration as being among the worst in the history of this country. I know that many of you will be angered by these words, but look at the facts. That president promised us that he would restore integrity to the White House, and did the opposite of what he promised. He said that he would only take the nation to war as a last resort, and only then as part of a true coalition, and then he did the opposite. He told us that the Iraqi people would welcome us, and then it turned out that the opposite was true. He said early on that he would not get involved in nation building, and then did the opposite. He led us to believe that he would have a sufficient number of troops on the ground for the beginning of that war, and that he had a plan after the war to win the peace, and then it turned out that the opposite was true on both counts. He did not initially want to set up the 9/11 Commission at all, until popular opinion forced the issue. He did not initially want to set up a person to head the country's intelligence agencies as recommended by the 9/11 Commission, but changed his mind when he found out which way the political wind was blowing. He consistently put political cronies in positions of power, often when, like the former head of FEMA and the president's own personal attorney, which he recommended for the Supreme Court, those people weren't qualified. In addition to all of that, to name just a few more serious problems that he created, he gave huge tax cuts that brought the most benefit to the very wealthy, and at the same time squandered a large surplus that could have been used to help Medicare, Social Security, much of the country's infrastructure, and perhaps even help us to provide health care for those in need. He was one of the chief architects, with the leaders of Congress as his faithful allies, of a plan to dismantle as many as possible of the environmental and social safety nets provided by both the environmental safeguards and the social program for the less fortunate that had been in place in our country for a great many years. During his administration and the administration of the two prior presidents, and as a result of the policies of these administrations, the very rich got very much richer, the very poor got very much poorer, and the middle class has been and still is shrinking rapidly. In addition, that president, George W. Bush, ignored or dismantled important treaties and agreements that others before him worked so hard to create. Through arrogance, he squandered the goodwill that was given to so freely to our country by the rest of the world. Even the country of Iran reached out to us after the tragedy of 9/11. And then, if all that weren't enough, he told us that we should continue to stay the course on all of these harmful policies. What a recipe for disaster. And sure enough, that's what we had. Then we found that the IRS was questioning the tax-exempt status of churches who dared to disagree with his policies, while never questioning those churches who agreed with his policies, regardless of the level of their participation in the political process. Through intimidation, name-calling, and even through the Patriot Act, that administration did everything that it could to stifle dissent in these United States of America. Perhaps he or someone in his administration, as I suspect also happened in some previous administrations, did learn one lesson from history, however, when he decided to invade Iraq and wanted to convince the American people that it was the right thing to do. Now, I realize that such quotes and comparisons are normally considered taboo, but in this case the point is so much on target that I feel strongly that it is justified. You'll know what I'm talking about when you read this quote from Hermann Goering, a high-ranking official in Hitler's Third Reich. Quote, "Of course the people don't want war, but after all it's the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy, a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament, or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked, and denounce the policies the pacifists, for lack of patriotism, and for exposing the country to greater danger." End quote. This sounds too familiar during the lead-up to the war with Iraq. Yet this same president was even re-elected for a second term, during which the scandals that surrounded the White House and the office of the vice president, who also still wants the country to torture people, and leaders in the White House and Senate. Restored integrity to the White House, indeed. as far as trying to understand why he was reelected in 2004 and why so many of the voters today still believe in him and his policies, you can see how persuasive the ultra-wealthy, through their corporate-oriented news media, have been over a great many years. They want to divide us so they can continue to rule effectively in their best interests and not in ours. While observing members of that administration and many of our country's top legislators, who still have a surprisingly large following, being applauded wherever they travel, I was reminded of another quote that I would like to share with you, if you will indulge me. In the final Star Wars film, released in 2005, one of the characters, Padme Amidala, while watching the Galactic Senate, wisely but sadly observes, quote, "So this is how liberty dies, to thunderous applause," end quote. Think about it. There have been previous presidents, both Democrat and Republican, who have been very hurtful to the country and its people. But thankfully, most of them didn't, through their policies, including a lack of safeguards and regulations, bring the United States of America to its knees or worse financially. Since the previous administration did that, however, it will take more than a year or two to come to full recovery. It's going to take several years. Unfortunately, we're a society that demands instant gratification, and despite the very deep hole that the new administration started from, the people want and demand that it all be fixed now, and they're threatening to vote back into power the very same people to put us in the hole in the first place. Can you believe that? In point of fact, this was actually done in the U.S. House of Representatives in the election of 2010. How sad that far too many of us as a society have such short attention spans and even shorter memories. Despite all that, I'm pleased, and we should all be grateful to be able to say, however, that finally, even though it took a worldwide financial crisis caused by greed and a failure of government to regulate effectively and adequately in order to bring it about, the people saw what was needed and elected in 2008 what appears to be a more thoughtful and a more reasonable man in Barack Obama, who seems to have a sincere interest in improving the lives of working people and their families. Excuse me. We seem to be finding, however, as earlier indicated, that the system under which we live will not allow truly effective change to be implemented. Don't ever forget the Business Roundtable and what I said about them. In addition, the very effective job that appears to have been done by the very wealthy and the corporate-oriented media has been able to persuade about 50% of the population of this country that this president, Barack Obama, elected in 2008, is planning to implement policies that will destroy the country. How very sad that such a decent man can be so effectively vilified with such a large percentage of the country's population. And this is not the first time that such a thing has happened. These people that are determined to maintain the status quo in their favor are very, very capable and very good at what they do. I want to thank you for watching session 21. In our next session, number 22, we'll finish our discussion of the media. Thank you.